All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 12, Section 3, Wealth and Culture in the South. So at the very top of Southern society was the Southern planter. So the Southern planter, we might say, was the top of Southern society. And, there's not sort of a hard cutoff as to what makes a planter, or what puts a person in this class, but in other textbooks and other sort of arenas, we could say that this means that there's generally an ownership of 20 enslaved people, right? So if a person owns more than 20 slaves, they belong to this elite Southern planter class. Again, these are the elite members of Southern society. They are marked by their wealth, but also their political power, which is important to understand. Many of those who make up the planter class also control politics. So if we look at slavery and the white class structure, let's take just a quick look at slave ownership among the white population. Most whites in the South belong to this category of non-slave holders. To own a slave was, really only possible by the more wealthy members of society. We see here 17.2% were slaveholders between 1 and 9, 6.6, 10 and 99, and then a very small percentage of elite Southern society, would own more than 100 slaves. This is 0.1%. So when talking about the planter elite, we're only referring to about, 2 to 3% of Southern society, right? The very rich. And, by comparison with the North, whereas those who were on top of Northern society were the industrial elite, those who owned the factories. Here it's more about ownership of land, ownership of slaves. It's less to do with bank account, more to do with the amount of wealth, right? Not necessarily, money per se. The planter elite were marked off by their stress on elegance. They were in some cases kind of like an American royalty in some ways. The textbook uses the term gentry to describe them. Very sophisticated homes, furniture, clothing, right? All these things were markers or indicators of someone being a member of the planter elite. Sophisticated architecture, gardens. This is where most of the money was held up in. The planter elite was very, very active in both local and national politics. So, governors of certain states, mayors of certain towns, members of the House of Representatives, senators, all of these positions were disproportionately held by the planter elite. Another key marker of this class in Southern society was really their absence from performing any sort of physical labor. So, in the South, sort of the less labor one performed, I will say less labor one performed, right? The sort of higher the status. And this also factored into, things like, fashion. So, for example, Southern women would wear very sort of sophisticated and really burdensome sort of clothing, which was an indicator that they weren't going to perform any sort of physical labor anytime soon. But this was also the case for children. So, for example, the children of the Southern elite did not engage in sort of any physical labor themselves, but often had high access to education. Interestingly enough, on the whole, the South was much less educated than the North. But if you looked only at the members or the children of the planter elite, they were some of the highest educated people inside the entire United States. Now, this participation in local and especially national politics meant that Southern planters had an enormous national influence. Recall the Three-Fifths Compromise from the Constitution. This gave Southern states, especially those slave-holding states, more representation in the House of Representatives, which also gives you more representation in the Electoral College. So if you look at national offices like the presidency, most presidents till 1860 were were Southern slaveholders, right? And presidents, of course, do have the power to choose members of the Supreme Court, so chosen by, the president, the way that the Supreme Court justices are chosen, right, by the president. So, if you just look at some of the most important offices, like the executive branch and the judicial branch, for the most part, up until 1860, they are dominated by the Southern planter elite. So a huge influence on national politics. And a lot of this national influence was used to protect the institution of slavery, to protect the wealth and power of the planter elite. Right before the planter elite, even though they are just a small fraction of Southern society, they have a lot of influence in terms of political power and wealth, are the yeoman farmers. The yeoman farmers are the independent white farmers that Jefferson envisioned being the backbone of a democracy. Right below them are the landless whites. So we might say the one thing that distinguishes the yeoman farmer from the landless whites is the land ownership. Sometimes these individuals are called the plain folk, right? Plain folk of the South. Again, this is the majority of the population, 75%, never reaching a wealth status attainable to own slaves, although for many of them that is, that's the goal or the idea. That really is the ticket to wealth and prosperity in the South if you're a white, if you're a white person in the South. However, though, despite the huge economic gap and really political gap between the planter elite and what we might call the plain folk or the poor whites, is this binding notion of white supremacy. Interestingly enough, the yeoman farmer and the landless whites, materially, in terms of the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the type of dwellings or buildings that they live in, actually have more in common with the enslaved population, but it's not economics that people sort of see themselves as. They see themselves more in racial terms. And white supremacy, of course, is the idea that whites are superior to blacks. This was the idea that united the planter elite and the poor whites. For as poor as a white person might be in the South, as long as slavery remained in place, they would never fall to the very bottom of society. So even though they didn't profit from it directly in terms of ownership, landless whites could always hope to become, or sorry, the plain folk in the South could always hope to become perhaps a member of the planter elite to own slaves themselves. But at the very least, as long as this system of white supremacy remained in place, they would never fully fall to the bottom of society. Another way of looking at it is to say that if slavery were to be abolished, the first people essentially being passed up on that economic and social system would be the poorest white farmer, and therefore has the most vested interest in protecting this institution. So again, larger in number, but still has an interest in upholding the system of slavery and racism in the South. Now, for Southerners, there was also a slightly different emphasis on culture. Recall that in the North, the wide access to material items made possible by the factory and transport by the railroad led to a much more material culture. In the South, there isn't quite the same infrastructure. So, looking at something like railroad mileage, the South remains much more disconnected in that place. And so a culture of materialism and consumption in the North isn't quite the case in the South. Instead, it's a culture more, focused on things like honor. Code of honor existed amongst both the elite and common classes. We might say about Southern culture, it was much more local, whereas people in the North are becoming more aware of an overall American identity. Culture in the South is much more local. By the time of the Civil War, more Southerners feel an allegiance to their state rather to their country, whereas that is less of the case in the North. And things like, preserving your name, your honor, these are worth protecting, whereas something like dueling was more or less made illegal and prohibited in the North. It was much more common in the South. It was acceptable, for example, to use violence in order to defend your name, defend your reputation, defend your honor. Not only more common and expected, but if you were someone who did not defend your honor, there could be serious social repercussions. You could be sort of ostracized by your group. For Southerners, especially in the elite planter class, gender was very rigid. We might say very rigid. Again, gender refers to the different role that men and women occupy in a society, especially, we'll say, especially among the planter elite. Within each household, the male was considered the patriarch or authority of the family. So the male was the authority within the family. All sorts of stereotypes associated with, strength, authority, being involved in the public sphere. Whereas for women, other characteristics such as piety, grace, and modesty came to characterize what it meant to be an ideal Southern woman. Again, you can kind of get a feel for it by the way that Southern women dressed. You can see this image right here. Very sort of sophisticated, practically impossible to walk around or do anything physical in. But again, that was sort of a sign of elite status. Now, we should be reminded here that within Southern society, again, a very rigid social structure. There's also a rigid social structure in the North, right? The division between the public and the private. It's less pronounced among the working classes of the North because men and women have to work to survive. It is practically nowhere to be seen in, in the way that enslaved men and enslaved women were treated, right? For the most part, men and women were required to do the same work. Now, when it was not, working in the fields, there was some gender division between men and women within the family. Women typically taking care of the children, men sort of doing other things besides that. But when it came to the actual labor required on the plantations, Southern, slaveholders did not consider men and women to have different roles in that respect. Now, as slavery, as the decades continued from the 1800s, 1810s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, all the way up to the 1860s, the Civil War, there's sort of, there's a number of different phenomena taking place, right? Slavery is expanding very rapidly due to cotton. Slavery is also shifting from the Chesapeake down south, further to the west, but also on a global level, slavery is becoming less and less common. Slavery is being abolished around the world. The United States bans the slave trade in 1808. The Atlantic slave trade is illegal. In 1831, Britain banned slavery. We might mention that, very early on in the 1790s, the northern states begin to ban it. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance prohibits slavery in the northern United States. In 1848, pretty much the rest of Europe does away with slavery. We could also mention the Haitian Revolution, 1801. So there's a lot of areas around the world that are moving away from slavery, whereas in the southern United States, it's somewhat of an anomaly where slavery is dramatically increasing. Couple that with the fact that the wealth and power that Southern slaveholders have in the United States and that desire to hold on to it. And so in terms of defending slavery, there'll be, powerful slaveholders in the South who look to use argument in order to try and preserve this institution. Probably the most well-known defender of slavery maybe in all of United States history is John C. Calhoun. So we might say, he defended slavery and by extension, the South, right? We know John C. Calhoun as being the former, he was a war hawk who helped the United States get into the War of 1812. He had been Jackson's vice president, had a falling out, and ultimately is probably best known up until this point for the tariff crisis, where he, really pushed for South Carolina to nullify the tariff of the 1830s. Jackson threatened to use an army upon him, and sort of Henry Clay came to the rescue and found a compromise. But here, John C. Calhoun is really speaking on behalf of those Southern planters, worried that a Northern majority, because the North is growing larger in terms of population, mainly due to immigration, might one day overrule the minority in the South, the Southern slaveholders, despite the Three-Fifths Compromise. So John C. Calhoun puts forward this idea of the concurrent majority, which is very confusing. It essentially means it's a minority / majority, kind of in his terms. In other words, it's a minority within the U.S., but a majority within the South, right? So in the entire United States, the planter elite is becoming smaller and smaller, but they're a majority in their particular neck of the woods. And so his idea is that a concurrent majority should be able to, in some sense, nullify laws, should be able to determine their own, self-determination. His work, Disquisition on Government, put forward the argument that Southern slaveholders and, by extension, the planter elite should preserve power within, that little W with slashes within, a growing anti-slavery, or actually, let's use the word free, because we'll describe the northern states as free states, within a growing free nation. Southerners will use all sorts of different arguments in order to try and justify slavery. Again, we talked about paternalism, the idea that slave owners took care of their slaves. They'll make the argument based off of how bad industrial capitalism is, right? Wage slavery is the idea that the North is worse, saying things like, well, at least slaves in the South get to work outside in the sun, whereas Northerners work in these dark, dingy factories. Or even polygenism. Polygenism is the idea that humans have different origins. Here, of course, talking about white and black, which is really just short for a scientific racism. Using racism, that blacks and whites are different as a means to justify slavery. So all these things were used to try and justify this institution. The bottom line was, in regards to slavery, is that all of these arguments, didn't hold any weight to them. And you could just simply kind of look at it in this sort of, in sort of this term, in opposition to any argument in favor of slavery. And that is no one, and I really mean no one, volunteered to be a slave, right? However bad the North might be, for as much as slave owners said they were taking care of people, no one, and again, I mean no one, volunteered to be a slave.